Welcome, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about some work that I undertook on my PhD, and it's become very pertinent right now because there's a new exploration licensing round just offshore from my field area. So hopefully today we'll get the chance to see how really quite an old-fashioned style PhD, going out into the field, collecting lots of field data, integrating all of the different aspects of the data sets, using them to kind of paint a picture of the sedimentary evolution of Eastern Borneo, how that is still relevant today in terms of the exploration. So as I said, we're exploring the far reaches of Eastern Borneo today. So the map on the right there is the map of Borneo. Malaysian Borneo is in the northwestern portion. So we have Sarawak, where the word Malaysia is. And then Sabah is what you can describe as the dog's head up there on the upper right. Let me see if I can use the pointer here. Here we go. So this area up here on the northeast is known as the dog's head, with the mouth sitting down there. And that basically about half of that dog's head was my field area. It's a huge field area, maybe 200 by 300 square kilometers. And I looked at about 15 formations, but the one I'm sharing with you today is definitely of most interest in my opinion. So we're visiting this Sandakan Peninsula on that northeast coast. And Sandakan is the second largest city in Sabah after Kota Kinabalu. Former capital of British North Borneo, and it was completely destroyed in World War II by the Allies because they considered it as something of a hotspot from in the World War. And then it was rebuilt since then, and it's really been kind of redefined as very much a port city. A lot of fishing going on there as well, and you can see these pictures at the bottom. It's still quite quiet and peaceful, but there are around 450,000 people in that municipal area, which extends out a long way from the city itself. And there hasn't really been much done on this area geologically since the 1950s until I was able to go out into the field. It was quite interesting because they put a new road through, running sort of northwest, southeast through the inland part of the continent. There was nothing there before. It was just rainforest. And they said, another geologist went there and said, there's all these outcrops along the road cuts, so you should get out there. And by the time the red tape has worked its way and I'd got my permits, I went out there and they were all completely overgrown. So all of them were gone, but fortunately there was lots of other information, lots of other outcrops, lots of new housing developments that were opening up outcrops for my benefit. So just to give you a little tiny flavor of the regional geology. So the whole area here is underlain by Cretaceous sediments, and they are ophiolitic. So you see serpentinites in the field, which is quite unusual. They weather to this lovely kind of chocolate soil. And then overlying that, you have a lot of deep water sediments. And we could talk a little bit more about those in the next slide, about where those came from. And then there was a huge tectonic impact collision related to the opening of the South China Sea and transferring of the seafloor spreading from one ridge to another ridge. And that created a huge area of melange deposits. So all of that pink there is melange deposits, which are literally, they look like sort of soil with gravel in it and bits of, but some of the pieces of rock that are incorporated into these mudstones are up their house size. So it was obviously a very dramatic tectonic event. And fortunately, because I wouldn't have known how to even start to analyze that had been undertaken by a previous PhD, a guy called Ben Clennell. Both of us were organized by the Southeast Asia Consortium, which is still going today. It's now based at Heriot-Watt University in Scotland. Anyway, he studied the melanges, but what I went to look at was these semicircular yellow basins that run across that map there. And it's funny because originally there was some theory that they were made by impact craters, so that there was a bunch of meteorites, and that's why they were all in a line. I went out there and I visited the Geological Survey when I arrived. I was telling them about all my plans, and I said, well, I'm going to start off with the Maliao Basin, which is the one down to the southwest there. And they said, oh, how are you planning on getting in there? And I said, well, I was hoping to drive in. And they said, well, actually, you can't get in there except by helicopter, or it's a 2.5-week walk. So I had to kind of redefine my PhD to some extent. So I actually looked at the two northeasterly basins there, and the one with the ring around it, the Sandakan Basin, is what we're going to focus on today. So this is just how these sediments came to be. So you've got this diagram on the lower left here is a regional map, and you can see that the South China Sea Basin sits up to towards this area here, with the Paracel Islands. So there was seafloor spreading going on in the South China Sea Basin, and it was moving these blocks towards the Borneo continent. And my favorite here is the Dangerous Grounds block. And obviously it was named that because so many ships foundered in that area. The Luconia Shoal here, just down a little bit further towards the west there, that's a very good gas province, and that's where a lot of work, Shell's doing a lot of work out there and exploiting these carbonate buildups full of gas. Anyway, these blocks were being moved towards the southeast during this seafloor spreading process in the South China Sea around 18 million years ago, and they collided with Borneo, and that was when it created the melange deposits, opened up some basins in which my Miocene deposits were deposited, and generally changed the whole tectonic configuration of the area. I mean, when you look at a map of this region, there are 20 or 30 subduction zones and spreading zones, all in a very small area geographically. So it is very complicated geologically. Fortunately, the area that I was working in was mainly just affected by faulting and folding rather than too much of the subduction. And then that cross section on the upper right there just shows this process in action, and gives you a little bit of an idea of how the seafloor spreading area actually was transferred due to the collision of these blocks with western Borneo. So the rest of the talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the sedimentology. So this is more of my BAS portion of the presentation. Then we're going to have a little bit of structural. So maybe we should have asked the structural guys to join us as well and just talk a little bit about the structural features and how they define the geology that's exposed on surface. And then we're going to finish off by going more into the kind of like the international realm. We're going to talk about the exploration potential of this region as well. And that's based partly on the work that I did and the new discoveries that I made and how they were able to kind of improve our understanding of what was going on with the geology. So first of all, the Sandakan Peninsula that we're going to be looking at today, it's about 20 kilometers across. There's a scale up there on the upper right. That's a 5 kilometer scale bar. So the area, this is the entirety of the Sandakan Peninsula. So we're looking at about a 15 to 20 kilometer wide, and then maybe 5 to 10 kilometers north to south. And in that area, as you can see, every one of those yellow dots is an outcrop, and every one of those sections there is a logged section. So the longest sections there are about 140 meters in length. I think I logged about 7 or 8 kilometers of section in Sandakan. And I had this idea of putting it into a map, and eventually I was able to do that. So this is back in the days when Adobe Illustrator had just started. They didn't have any layers or anything like that. And so I built this map, and then I was trying to kind of like tart it up a bit, make it look nice. And I just moved it slightly and accidentally moved the whole map. And it took 7.5 minutes for that moving of the map to occur, because obviously computer speeds were a little bit less agile than they are today. Anyway, I'm not going to take you through all of these exposures. I'm not going to take you through all of these outcrops. What we're going to do is to look at the basic facies, different facies that we see there, the facies associations, and then we're going to pull together the geology itself. So let's start off with what definitely my favorites, which is mangroves and fossil mangroves. And that I was very fortunate that I had some of the best exposed fossil mangroves anywhere in the world, particularly on the clastic side. And there's still very little work done on these. There's still only a few papers published, and I really need to get on with publishing a bit more on this area. But what you can see here is that we have these thick mudstones, which are full of fossils, and we'll talk about some of those fossils in a moment, very organic rich. And then we have these nice little channels, which you'll see in the upper picture here. There's a nice small channel there, maybe only 10 meters across. There's a meter rule there for scale that you can just about see. And then I put in a modern analog picture just for each of these, just to give you a feel for it. And then we also have these much more sheet-like sandstones as well. So that lower right-hand side there, sheet-like succession with these very gently dipping cliniforms. And after seeing about 20 or 30 of these outcrops and pulling the data together, I've come up with this model here where we've got the channels in these deposits, and then we have these open areas in the middle, which I've called broads, just because they're like the Norfolk Broads. And funnily enough, they're nothing really like the Norfolk Broads, but I just needed a term for kind of open areas. And if you go to somewhere like the Everglades today, then you'll see exactly this pattern as well, with these open areas, which have kind of like winnowed bases to them. And then we have lots of small channels running through where you can go kayaking through there and get lost very, very easily. So the mudstones that you see in there, which I've called mangrove mudstones here, often have kind of like gentle wave rippling within them, and they're very organic rich. There's lots of rooting in there as well. The lower right-hand picture there shows you some of that rooting as well. And then there's a really rich fauna, and anybody who's been to modern mangroves, apart from the fact that there's an awful lot of insects there, usually they're full of life and everything from, animals, plants, and invertebrates and vertebrates as well. So you get lots of these gastropods here. And at the time, I wasn't aware how significant these gastropods are, but there are very specific gastropods that live in these areas. And Telescopium, which is a kind of like a turret almost, it's a conical gastropod, and other gastropods, which are very, very indicative of these environments. And you still see a lot of these in the modern world as well. And then we have this bored wood here that's bored by teredos, so boring bivalves, anything but boring. That's a very poor term for them because they're very interesting. And there's also some species that I have no idea what they are. And I've not even been, to this day, we still don't know what they are. They're tubular calcitic structures with a kind of like a crest running along the top. We wonder whether there's some kind of serpulid worm, but we don't know yet. So that some species that's new to science, but has not yet been described. So being mangroves, obviously, there's lots of, if I was going to tell you they were mangroves, you need to see trees in there as well. And there are some beautiful rooted tree fossils. You can see on the upper left here, we have this rooted tree with this buttressing around the sides. And those buttresses are very similar to the modern buttress trees that you see within modern mangroves. That picture there is actually from the Klang Delta in Peninsular Malaysia, the modern picture. And I found this fossil forest, and it's funny because the whole area was clear and hadn't been built on, which is pretty unusual in Sandakan. You clear an area off and somebody puts a house there within about 10 minutes. And so I asked somebody, well, why is this area still open? And he said, oh, the police station is right there. And it was right next to the police station. So the migrants just didn't dare to build a house there. I tried to get this preserved because it was such a wonderful outcrop. And really, unfortunately, the Sabah government had more important things to do than try and look after my suggestions. So there's the trees that you see there. This is a cross-section of a trunk of one of these trees, and it's really nicely ringed. So there's seasonality here. And when you go to Borneo and that part of the world today, there really is no seasons. It's just every day it gets dark at 6 o'clock, it gets light at 8 o'clock, and there's a rainy season and a dry season, but there's really not much difference between them. But definitely there was more seasonality back in the Miocene. Fossil leaves as well, and then I had this beautiful amber deposit. So that my amber class were up to this size. So for those of you, it's like an ostrich egg size, amber class. And when you broke them open, instead of being cloudy, they were just this clear amber, and it would split into these layers. So I collected quite a lot of amber and sent it off to the Natural History Museum when I got back. And they found lots of insects in there. And they're very excited to share this with the world. First amber from Borneo. And then somebody pointed out that there was one paper, it was only half a page, written in 1947 by this German geologist. So that all of that went away, and the press release was taken away and everything, but we did get some lovely insects out of it. So the 3 insects I have there are a parasitic wasp at the top, new species, ant in the middle, and then a cute little millipede at the bottom there. So pretty cool. And I was actually out in Borneo doing field work when the museum managed to get hold of me. This is pre-email or anything like that. So they managed to get a phone number from my hotel, and I had to ring them back. When I say hotel, that's pretty glossy term for what it was. But nonetheless, they phoned me back and they told me that all of these insects have popped out of the amber. So that was a fantastic day. So other fauna, one of the nice things is that you get these mangrove lobsters, and they are obviously very significant because they tell you you're definitely in the mangroves. So this is Thalassina here. That's about 10 centimeters long, this specimen. And you get lots of their footprints as well. And the footprints are pretty indicative as well. So this is a mangrove lobster disco party area where all of the mangrove lobsters were obviously hanging out. And that's a picture of a modern one of those species as well. So they're still around today. And then probably one of my most exciting finds out there was a whole bed of bird footprints. And I've just circled a little sample there with 3 of the bird footprints on it. We think they're made by a plover. And then while I was at this quarry where the bird footprints came from, I found this weird trace fossil here, which is this kind of in the bottom in the middle there with just the pencil for scale. So I'll just bring the pointer down there. You see this trace fossil here. So I had no idea what it was. And I would like to credit Murray Gingras from U of A, because I showed him this and he said, I think that's a bird feeding trace. So the bird was literally going like this with its beak, like an avocet does, sifting through the water and through the substrate. And it left this kind of snaking back and forth trail, swish feeding trail. So that's a new type of trace fossil as well, which I'm busy writing a paper up at the moment to describe that and give it a name. I'm going to use the Latin name for brush, like if you're brushing or sweeping, to try and as its name. Okay, so that's the mangroves. And then when you go outboard from the mangroves, you start going into the shore face deposits. And we're going to look at the shore faces next. And I can tell you that some of the shore face deposits were up to 100 and 120 meters in thickness, which are basically just stacked sandstones. Some of the sandstones were pretty much pure sandstones with organic rich layers, like the one on the upper right there. That is Neil Harbury for scale there, who is the guy who started up Nautilus, the geological training organization, who was my PhD supervisor. You occasionally get these thin gray mudstones interbedded with these deposits that you can see on the lower left here. And then you also see beautiful wave rippled surfaces. And what's happened here is that the groundwater is percolated along just at the base of each of these mudstone layers, and it's cemented up these ripples so that when they're exposed, the mudstone weathers off them, and then you just get left with these perfect structures. And you can see that the wave ripples there, and they're oriented in different directions, and that suggests that the water depth is less than 5 meters in these deposits. So this is just one example here of a quarry. This is actually where the bird footprints came from. They were down to the right of the jeep there, the bird footprints. But we are looking. I'll just put the pointer on here so we know which picture we're talking about. So we're looking here at a section of several shore faces here, and what you tend to see is they have a bit of an estuarine component at the base, and then they pass up into more marine deposits as well. So there's lots of these shore faces across the island. They have nice marine trace fossils in them, but not many other fossils apart from that. So you're getting nice Ophiomorpha in there, and these are just some good examples of those Ophiomorphas, which tend to burrow down, and then when they get to an organic rich layer, then they spread out laterally as well. And so I have this analog, which is peculiarly inappropriate. And funnily enough, we're back in Norfolk where the Broads were, but now we're at the Norfolk coast. So we have these kind of very sand-rich deltaic deposits and shallow marine deposits. And I think that this forms quite a nice analog, because you've got to really explain why you've got these incredible thicknesses of sandstone with almost no intervening mudstones at all. Okay, so now we're going to look at the lower shore face. And so we're moving out into deeper water. Lower shore face is usually defined sort of like at the uppermost storm wave base. So probably about 40 meters water depth. It's always hard to put an exact figure on it. And what I found in these deposits, and what makes them so easy to recognize, is they had a lot of scour features within them. So these are called gutter casts. They have about 20 other names sedimentologically, but I use the term gutter cast here. First described by Whittaker in 1973. And this is from his paper where he shows these features. And if you look at the scale on these, which you probably can't see at the back, but I can tell you that each of these bars here is 10 centimeters. So he's looking at scour features that maybe got up to about 10 or 20 centimeters in width. Well, in Borneo, we're at another scale here. And I do think the reason for this is that you had these very tropical conditions at the time with the mangroves and things, very large storms. And so the runoff that was running off down towards the deeper waters was very powerful currents. So they were creating structures that are 3 meters deep, 50 to 100 meters wide. So this is 2 scales above this little small scale stuff that Whittaker was describing. So these are pretty much the biggest in the world that I've seen in the literature or in the field. And just for that upper right hand picture there, you can see that's the trusty meter rule for scale sitting in there. So that's just some examples here. What you also see is that in the mudstones, first of all, there's lots of nice trace fossils in there, but you also get these starved ripples. So it's showing that there's a lot less sand getting out here. A lot of the sand is being trapped in those upper shore face deposits near the coast. So the scour characteristics here, they're actually formed by what you have storm surges where you have the wind and a strong tide, flow tide that's coming up towards land, and everything kind of like pushes up against the coast, and you can end up raising sea level by as much as 15 meters in certain circumstances. So there's around New York, they have a lot of problem with storm surges. So they're building a 10-meter high wall around the whole of New York, Manhattan Island. And just to let you know that while they're busy building it, it has already been breached. So there's storm surges more than 10 meters in height. So obviously a lot of the water comes on shore and then it starts flowing back offshore again. And that's what creates these structures. So the characteristics of these is that they're normally steep-sided. There's a lot of kind of swirling currents going on. So this lower right-hand diagram here, pencil for scale, the currents are swirling around on the seabed and just cutting these very steep-sided shapes. And the nice thing about that is it also gives us paleocurrent directions as well. And we're going to come back to paleocurrents in a few minutes, but the characteristics of these structures makes them very easy to recognize as well. So there's me, younger days, slimmer, fitter, probably wiser than I am now. But anyway, there's me by the outcrop, just to show you the size of some of these scour features that we're seeing sitting in there. So they're really amazing. One of the best outcrops I had in my field area was this 100-meter thick succession that had been cut into a hillside so that they could put a new big housing development in. And what you see here is that at the bottom, we're in the offshore transition. So very muddy sediments. We'll talk about those in a minute, but with just a couple of very small gutter casts. But then when we get up to the central portion here, which I would describe as your kind of classic storm-dominated lower shore face deposits, we can see lots of scouring sitting in there. I've kind of picked out the sandstones on this Adobe Illustrator image here to show you. And then up at the top there, we go into the upper shore face as well. And once again, because of all of the scours in here, I'm able to get really good paleocurrent data from here about the orientation of those offshore directed currents. When you look in at the scoured interval in more detail, you can see that we've got localized areas where there's more scouring, which suggests that we're having a storm partitioning, it's called, where the storm currents are not, where those offshore directed currents are really focused in certain areas. And I've just tried to put that together in this sketch here on the lower right. But yeah, some beautiful outcrops here. And what we're seeing as we go up through the succession is that the accommodation space is decreasing, and we're having more stacking of those beds as we go up towards the upper shore face deposits at the top, so the shallower marine deposits at the top. And some of the other features just to point out here, first of all, there's lots of lovely trace fossils. As I mentioned, I've just shown you some Zoophycus burrows there, but we had some really nice Astrosoma and the slightly deeper water traces, not deep water, but going out, lower shore face. And then we also have these really striking beds where you'll have a sandstone beds that's completely overturned and contorted. And the nice thing about these is you can track them for a kilometer and a half laterally. So that makes me think that these are actually seismites. So you're getting shaking of the ground over quite a wide area. So I actually had a definition that they had to extend for more than 500 meters. Otherwise, I'd just say they were dewatering. If they went for more than 500 meters, then I'd describe them as seismites. And I had about 6 of these beds within my overall shore face succession. So this is just to show you what they look like in detail here. So that they are dewatering structures, but they're driven by earthquakes. And then we go into the offshore transition. This is the deepest marine sediments that we see in Sandakan. So we're at the very end here of the storm deposits. So probably about 75 to 100 meters water depth. And what we see here is these thick mudstones with just very thin little cemented intervals. So I think you can just see here, there's my hammer for scale. And these cemented intervals are maybe 1 to 5 centimeters in thickness. And they've acted as nucleus for all of the groundwater that's percolating through there. So the groundwater can't really get through the mudstone, so it goes through these little channels and cements them up. And in doing so, it's the paleontologist's friend because it's preserved all of these beautiful fossil crabs and other fossils as well. So this is a new kind of nautiloid, an argonaut. So that's actually an octopus egg case that was found in one outcrop. And I had one particular outcrop, which was very close to the airport. And I'd go there. It's probably about, 6 times the size of this room. So not very big. And I found 26 species of fossil crab in that one outcrop. And a lot of them were new to science as well. So I was able to name them after people who'd helped me with my PhD. So I actually talked to a guy who was one of the plantation owners. And they have a little version of the crab in their reception when you go into the plantation offices. They have this tiny little crab in a giant showcase because it's named after their company. So just to summarize all of this sedimentology, what we see here is 3 main environments. We have the mangroves and upper shore face, shallow marine succession up here at the top with the channels running down towards the sea. And then we'll talk about what happened with these currents when you go into the shallow offshore. Then we move from the shallow marine. We have some nice scour surfaces in there, which I picked out in red. And then we finally move down into the more shelfal deposits where we have these smaller features, smaller scour features, but still quite significant. And then they pass out into this crab-dominated offshore transition zone. And I put together a kind of summary section through here to show you what it would look like if you went from the shallowest deposits at the bottom here on the left, the mangrove mudstones, up through the shore faces, and then off into the muddy shelf at the top. Now, one thing that I should have mentioned here is that if you go back to the early literature from the Sandakan Formation, they estimate the thickness to be somewhere between 600 meters and 1,300 meters of section that's exposed. And I will show you in a few minutes why that is complete nonsense, but I'll show you that in the structural sense. So I mentioned paleocurrents earlier and how important the paleocurrents are. And this is the paleocurrent data, which I will be honest with you is not the most interesting slide of the talk, I don't think. But what we see here is that I've put the mangrove deposits at the top, and we can see the channels are basically moving towards the northeast, and the current ripples that are associated with these channels are also northeastward. So just remember that, they're northeastward orientated. Then we go into the upper shore face in the middle there, and you'll see that all of the paleocurrent directions are towards the northwest. So the trough cross beds, the planar cross beds, and then what I've done with the wave ripples is I've taken the crests and just given you an orientation in both directions. So theoretically, the currents could be going one way or the other way because they're basically cyclic currents and oscillating currents, but they've also directed towards the northwest and towards the southeast. Then when we go down into those channels at the bottom here, that you could call them recurrent channels, but the best name for them is these gutter casts. The gutter casts, once again, are dominated towards the northeast. So why does it matter? Why do we care? Well, when you pull all of this together, the way that this diagram is arranged is that we have the Sandakan Peninsula here outlined in blue. We have the mangrove deposits in green at the bottom, the shore face deposits in yellow for the upper shore face, so shallow marine, deepening into the brown where you have those all of our gutter cast features, and then out into the crabs at the top here. And the crab deposits do have some little scour features as well. And what we see from the paleocurrents is that the mangroves are flowing out towards the northeast. You get out into the shore face deposits and everything's longshore drift and everything's towards the northwest. And then when you get out further and you get more of the storm influence, all of the storm influence is back towards the northeast as well. So I've literally been able to use the paleocurrent data to reconstruct the paleogeography of the entire Sandakan Formation and all of its outcrops. So it's just a real lesson in that taking all of those readings, which I mean, every outcrop I went to, I'd take 5 or 10 readings to try and get as much data as I could. And I really wondered whether I was ever going to use it. But when I started plotting it up, it all became clear, and it helped to really justify putting this diagram together like this. So we obviously had paleo land back in the day, back in the Miocene, down here towards the south of the mangroves. Unfortunately, this is all eroded away, so you don't really get to see much in there. And this is all so heavily vegetated down in this island down here that you don't get to see what's going on. But if I was to go and look for fluvial deposits, I'd be looking in that area towards the southwest. So I said I was going to talk about structural geology. I should just mention this. This is one of Sandakan's famous landmarks. It's called Batu Sapi, which means the rock cow. And because it's supposed to look exactly like a cow. And it's sitting here on one of the roundabouts there. This is actually not the original. This is a cast that they made. The original sits in the shallow marine offshore. So there is another one. I actually went to visit the one offshore just to check on the geology. And so you access it through this wood plant, and then they take you out on a rowing boat, and you have to give your passport in before you're allowed to go. I don't want to let my passport go. I might never get out of here. But anyway, they did look after my passport for me, but it was a bit of a nerve-wracking moment. So we're going to look at the structural features, as I said. So first of all, let's talk about these subcircular basins. There's lots of models for how they might have formed, including that meteorite impacts that I talked about. But there's definitely some kind of sag feature. There's faults around the edges of them. And you can see this is one example here up at the top. And this is about 20 kilometers across. This is not the Sandakan Basin. This is the Bukit Garam. So the next structure down on our map here, Sandakan sits up here and Bukit Garam sits down here. And then you move out to the Maliau that I mentioned earlier down here as well. So these basins, they do seem to have a lot of faulting associated with them. And my theory, based on all of the field work that I did, is that you have a big basin that was originally oriented from southwest to northeast. And what we've got is just remnants of this basin. So the basin was these sediments were deposited, early Miocene, big sheet of this clastic deposits. And then what happened was that got folded, really quite tightly folded. And we saw that all of the anticlines had been eroded off. And we're left with these synclinal basins. So the actual shape of that basin is kind of weird, because you don't expect to see a basin that's got this very cup-like outline to it, but that's what you see, and that's because only the synclines are preserved and not the anticlines. And I'll show you an analog here from the Kutai Basin, which is down way south. So this is on that map there, you can see we're now in Kalimantan in Indonesia, and this is work that was done by LASMO. They held onto some of the oil fields. So what you see is in the study area here, this is called the Runtu block. This is an exploration block. Then we see the same thing exactly, where you have these very tight shale cored anticlines, and then we have these synclinal basins in between them. And in the offshore, these are producing oil. Onshore, unfortunately not, but there are shows in there as well. And then the lower right here, we can see a cross section which shows basically the same pattern that I was seeing in my area in northeastern Borneo. And here in southeastern Borneo, we have this pretty much the same structural configuration. I see a lot of faulting within my field area, within that Sandakan Peninsula. This is that island that's just off to the east of the main peninsula. And it was a lovely day that I got to go out in my friend's boat, one of the plantation owners. They kind of adopted me as a mascot, and they let me use their boats now and again. So I went out to this island, logged the sections, which basically this is all sand. So that, like I was saying about these 100-meter thick sandstones, this is what you see on the cliffs and the island. And each of these is representing a fault intersection. So you can use these to start mapping the faults out. So there's another one sitting in here. So you have a fault line running along the ridge there, and then a conjugate faults running along the outline of the island here as well. And this is the one place where you could see the basal contact. So over in this flat area here was actually volcanics, which are Eocene in age. And that's the floor, the immediate floor to what I'm seeing in my Sandakan Basin, the bedrocks. And just to show, this is an aerial photo that I took from Google Maps earlier this week, just to show how these faults are running across this island. So there's lots of different outcrop data, once again, so not just from a sedimentological point of view, but there's these lovely scarp faces here where some of these faults are exposed. We've got this orthogonal jointing, which ties into them as well. And then we've got the occasional normal fault exposed in outcrop, although those seem to be rarer at that scale. And I also use some creekology, which I think some of the older geologists in the room may be familiar with, where you're using creek orientations to try and work out what's going on, and some of the ridges as well. So this is just a picture which just gives to act as a key. So what I've done here is that I've got these ridges with so I've used these ridges to work out where the traces of the faults are. And where a star is where you've got the fault pinches out. So you've got these faults that increase in throw towards the southwest. And you're going to see those on the next picture. And then I've also got lots of creeks here. And you can see the creeks are oriented in particular directions. And I think that relates to underlying basement faulting. So this is what the Sandakan Peninsula looks like, my phantasmogram here. So I've basically taken all the aerial photos. So I've got my 3D stereoscopic glasses that I've used to do all of this interpretation. I told you it was a nice old-fashioned PhD. Didn't tell you quite how old. But in there, you can see we've got 4 of these faults, which are scissor faults, which are basically pinching out towards the northeast and then thickening up to 100 meters towards the southwest or more. So we see all of these. And then we've got all of these creek orientations here, the mangrove creeks that are also mapping out the fault systems as well. So this is what the faults look like. You can see we've got the joint patterns there, which are matching up beautifully with what we see in the outcrop as well. And I mentioned earlier about the Sandakan Basin and saying how it's been judged to be 600 to 1,300 meters in thickness. And the reason for that, we're now standing about 50 kilometers to the south of the Sandakan Basin. We're standing on the roof of the Gomantong Caves, which are down here, which is another part of my PhD, which is on limestones. And the most interesting thing about those caves is they produce a lot of bird's nest soup and that kind of thing. So you go in there and there's all these rattan ladders hanging down from the ceiling with these guys hanging off them, collecting the bird's nests, and I went right up to the top of the hill with them, which is about, I don't know, 200 meters climb up to the top of the hill. And I walk into this room and they've got this giant TV screen and they're all watching soccer. I think it was the World Cup that was on, but it's amazing that they've managed to get their own generators up there. They've got a giant TV screen because those are obviously the most important thing to birds' nest harvesters. Anyway, we're looking towards the north here, and you can see that the cross section has got I've marked out the fault scarps and the dip slopes that are on there. So what's happened is that you've had all of these fault blocks. So they've got fault block, fault block, fault block, fault block running across, and they've added the thickness for all of those. But if you put this back palaeospastically back together, that scarp face there is the same as that scarp face there, correlates to that one, correlates to that one, correlates to that one. So you basically can put everything back together, and it just takes that huge thickness and just squeezes it down to about 200 meters in thickness. So let's just talk about oil and gas prospectivity. So offshore from Sandakan, I didn't see many seeps and things like that onshore, but offshore there's been quite a lot of interest here. As I said, that it's now a renewed target for exploration. And we can see that they've subdivided this into several basins. So Sandakan is sitting up here, that's Sandakan, and there's right in the middle of the central Sabah Basin, as opposed to the Sandakan Basin, which you would think would be offshore from Sandakan, but it isn't. It's not very well named, but anyway, these basins have been the focus of quite a lot of exploration interest. And I'm just putting my diagram I showed you earlier with my reconstruction of this Sabah Basin sitting in here, and then it correlates very closely to what they've identified from seismic. So this seismic was done after my PhD. So anyway, that's where they got this data from. And so what they did is they've just announced last year that this is a new exploration target, renewed target. So there's these two blocks here, which are now of interest for exploration. And they produced some maps showing where there were 5 discoveries offshore in the drilling that was done offshore already that they had to base their exploration tactics upon. And then down here, anything that's red or green is oil and gas related. So these are gas seeps down here and oil with gas shows. And then in the offshore, we've got 5 gas discoveries as well. So definitely potential here. The kind of play models that I put together would have, obviously reservoir would be these sandstones, and these sandstones they continue out into the offshore. Lots of source rocks there, particularly the mangrove, I think would be your best source rocks. And the interesting thing is that amber, you basically just have to blow on it and it turns into oil. So you only have to heat it up to about 140 degrees C, and it just, the whole amber disappears and you're left with this really high grade oil in there as well. And that apparently is responsible for about 55% of the oil in Brunei. So this amber is obviously a good sign of the potential for source rocks sitting there as well. So what kind of traps could we expect in the offshore? Well, there's already some carbonate buildups which have been drilled, but you also, funnily enough, this is a picture, this line here is that line sitting in there, and you can see we've got, once again, another one of our subcircular basins, these synclinal basins sitting in here. And then this line here, which is the one further to the southeast, that line sitting there, BB prime, this is showing the offshore progradation of my shore face deposits. So the deltaic portion of my shore faces is going off away just from the Sandakan. So the Sandakan area is this area just up here again. So you go offshore from here and you're starting to see the progradation towards the northeast. So plenty of opportunity here. And what they really need to do is to stop drilling these carbonate buildups and drill more of the clastic deposits so I can get more data. So just to summarize with a picture of this lovely snake that I saw in the field, which I asked one of the Malaysians, one of the local geologists, I said, I saw this amazing snake, bright green with this kind of diamond-shaped head. Do you know what kind of snake it is? He said, where did you see it? I said, well, it was in a tree. He said, that's the green tree snake. So, so just to conclude, very old-fashioned PhD study. I collected a lot of data and integrated it. The Sandakan Formation, I basically squeezed it from 1,300 meters down to about 220 meters in thickness. And it passes laterally from mangroves into offshore deposits. And it's a remnant of a much more extensive basin. And one day, hopefully, I'll get to the Palaeontological Basin and get to see what it looks like in there. That basin down to the southwest, just for interest's sake, has coal deposits up to 20 meters in thickness. So there's definitely interest in there to go and start mining these out as well. So I do think that the access will be there pretty shortly. We saw lots of structural data as well, and there's lots of nice faults cutting through this area, including some really classic scissor faults, and that stunning outcrops and fossils, despite being in an equatorial setting. I mean, there are plants there that grow so fast, you can watch them grow. If you're willing to spend half an hour, you can literally see these plants that are they're growing. There's one plant where you touch the leaves and they fold up. I'm trying to think what it's called. Not ambrosia, but something like that. Anyway, so there are plants that literally grow inches a day. So they are busy coating all of these outcrops. So your outcrops are temporary, which also means no one can check what I did and check whether I was logging correctly or not, because those outcrops are all gone. And I just want to finish by saying, yeah, there is oil and gas potential, obviously, in this area, but I would also say amazing place from an ecotourism point of view. How many field areas have real orangutans? So I interacted with orangutans, saw elephants. They're dwarf elephants that are imported from Brunei in the 1800s, but they're still there, and crocodiles in the rivers as well. So it's a pretty amazing field area. So with that, I'll just say thank you.